Hello. It is January 5th, 2025. I am in Cloudcroft, New Mexico, 9,000 feet high. January 5th. Very important day for me. Anniversary of my husband's passing. He passed away on January 5th. And for years, I couldn't get through this day. I thought it would kill me every year. I was just miserable. I had no longer had any belief in an afterlife after seeing the enormous change in his behavior and his personality after his frontal lobe brain injury. And whoa, this is heavy. And I figured your brain is your brain, and when you're dead, when your brain dies, you're dead. So part of my extreme grief was also the belief, the firm belief that I had developed that Roy no longer existed. Of course, my friends would tell me, of course he does, and stuff. And they knew I'd always believed in God. And, life, I still believed in God. It has nothing to do with life after death. Nothing. But at any rate, there had been a lot of things that had gone on since Roy's passing that seemed like miracles. And Roy passed here at the cabin. And it's where I feel closest to Roy and the reason why I'm living up here now, besides for the fact for the clean, fresh air. But why I'm so content being here at the cabin. I'm content here because I feel closest to Roy here. And it's my desire that someday I'll die here at the cabin. I don't know how I'm going to die. Of course, none of us do. But I have had this feeling in my head. I'll probably be killed by a cougar. Hopefully not. At any rate, there had been a lot of miracles going on. And I was chalking them all up to coincidence. Just wild coincidence. These so-called miracles. I mean, really strange things that had been going on. And I just said, well, that's just a coincidence. Oh, that's just a coincidence. Oh, that's just a coincidence. Ah, it's a coincidence. No, no, no. It's not Roy trying to get through to me. Coincidence, 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 coincidence. It used to drive my mother nuts. It drove my friends nuts. One of my friends sent me a whole bunch of books trying to get through to me. Feathers Brush My Heart. Some woman who had written, actually it's a very good book about stories from daughters whose mothers had passed away and the signs that their mothers had sent them. And I still have she sent me a bunch of books. I still have I read them all. And I was in a frame of mind. I think it was like 2 years after Roy had passed. And I tend to write in the margins of books or underline things and whatnot. I go back and I look at my notes. What an idiot, what an idiot, what a sap. Grow up, that's not a miracle, it's centrifugal force, blah, 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 blah. I'm just, knocking all these supposed miracles down, left, right, and center, and referring to these women who got such comfort from stuff as saps, who don't think they need to grow a brain, blah, blah, blah. I laugh now, but back then. At any rate, Karen, Roy's big sister, his favorite, his beloved big sister. Karen and I were like, she was the closest thing to a sister I've ever had, even, my sister-in-law. And Karen mourned Roy almost as much as I, because he was her favorite sibling as well. They were one of 6 kids. And Karen's 1 year older than Roy, 2 years older than I am. And what got me, of all the many miracles that were going on, that I kept saying was coincidence, just very briefly, because it's cold out here and I need to split wood. Karen became horribly ill from, there had been a big fire where she was, and she had had a lot of smoke inhalation, and that caused some kind of lung condition, and she also had pneumonia and whatnot, and she wasn't in the best of health at the time. And I got a phone call every year after Roy passed. I would come up here to the cabin and spend vigil from about January 3rd to January 7th, and it's sort of keeping watch and mourning. And Karen's husband I was packing up to come up here, and Karen's husband called me, and he never talks on the phone, ever. He says like 2 words max. And he said, Karen's in the hospital. Well, there's only one little hospital in Weatherford, Texas. So I called it and asked for her. They transferred me to her. She was in ICU, and she could hardly talk, could barely speak. Nothing above a whisper, and it was extremely labored talking. And they didn't expect her to survive. She had a suddenly horribly swollen leg that was so swollen it was cutting off the circulation, and the plan was for her to have it amputated the next day. She had diabetes, and that's part of the reason why she had that horribly swollen leg. And that just stressed her. But she couldn't even... Wayne had explained some of that to me. But she was in ICU. They were expecting her to die, essentially. And that's why Wayne had called me. She was on her deathbed. And we said our goodbyes. And Karen couldn't even finish what she was saying, because suddenly she went into this horrible spasm of something, and the ICU nurse, the phone had dropped, you could hear it clank, and the ICU nurse grabbed it and said, I have to go, I'm terribly sorry. And I said, no, I understand, go right ahead. So at any rate, that was that evening. The next morning, January 3rd, I came up here to the cabin, drove up here from El Paso, and kept vigil. And all during that time, I'm mourning Roy. It was the 2006. And I would talk out loud as if Roy could hear me, but I didn't think he could hear me. But I would pray for him every day, and I'd say, God, if Roy's alive, please let him be in heaven with you, blah, blah, blah. And my thinking was, if there's an afterlife, well, I knew Karen would go to heaven. She's one of the finest Christian women I've ever met. And totally self-sacrificing. And I asked God, please stop Karen's suffering. Please take her on to heaven with you, if there's a heaven. I can't imagine that you would let Karen just go into non-existence like you let the rest of us. And because she was that good, she was really a hidden saint of the world. And I asked God, I said, and if Roy exists, which I don't think he does anymore. I think that we just die and that's it. And poor Jesus died for nothing. Save us from what? When we're dead, we're dead. That's what I was telling God. I talked to God out loud too. And I certainly was up at the cabin at that time. And I said, but please, if there's another life, please let Roy escort Karen to heaven. She's such a good woman. She does not need to be suffering like this. And she would hate it if she had to live her life, if she survived this, if she had to live her life with an amputated leg. She would absolutely hate that. So I spent the day of January 5th, well, the whole day of January 4th, and the day of January 5th in prayer and meditation and That was my prayer and meditation. And a sense of mourning. Because as far as I was concerned, why was I still alive? Roy is my soulmate, and why am I still here? I didn't like it. So at any rate, I went back to El Paso January 7th. When I got home, it was too late to be bothering Wayne. I was dreading having to call Wayne and tell him how sorry I am that Karen has passed. And I was dreading that call. It was too late. They're an hour ahead. I would call him first thing in the morning to express my condolences because we all knew that Karen was going to die. So the next morning, January 8th, I steeled myself for the phone call, and I made the phone call. Karen answered the phone. She answered the phone sounding like nothing was wrong with her. She answered the phone saying, hello, and I said, Karen? Long story short, because it's getting dark. On January 5th, she said 3 days ago, and I looked at the calendar and I realized that was January 5th, Roy appeared to her at her bedside ICU bed. She said she just hated what was going on. Oh, I forgot to also say Karen had been recently diagnosed with cancer too. And when she'd been diagnosed with cancer about 4 months earlier. And that was just horrifying. And she hadn't had any proper treatment because she didn't have health insurance through her job. And she had to then quit her job because she was getting sicker and sicker. I mean, she would, and that was another thing. And Karen is sounding fine. Nothing's wrong with her lungs. Nothing's wrong. Nothing's wrong. You would never know that she was at her deathbed just 3 days before, and I had talked to her on the evening of the 3rd, where she was in the ICU, and everyone's expecting her to pass. And she's sounding fine, happy, just great. And she said, you wouldn't believe it, Emily Claire. She said that Roy appeared at her bedside in ICU and looked at her. She said he looked just like himself, except for just a little bit younger than when she had last seen him. And he had a little bit more hair. She said he had more hair than when she had last seen him. She said he looked like when you all got married. And Roy was 31 when we married, and I was 30. And she was so shocked. She said he looked not like a ghost or not like anything else. He looked solid. And he looked at her and he said, Karen, you wouldn't believe what heaven's like. No one is sick. No one is injured. No casts. No canes. No illness of any kind. Everybody's healthy, Karen. And she's staring at him. Can't believe she's seeing her brother. And then she turns to try to get a nurse because she's in ICU. And the nurse comes over and she's just shocked. And Karen's, getting out, barely getting out because she can hardly talk. Did you see my brother, the doctor? He was standing right here next to me. Did you see him? And nobody saw him. The nurse didn't see him. She said she kept asking the nurse, you had to have seen him. You had to have seen him. No one had seen him. And I thought that was funny, though. She's saying, my brother, the doctor. But she was saying, my brother, the doctor, he was standing right here just now. Didn't you see him? Didn't anyone see him? And as she's talking like this, she's talking better and better. The swollen leg, that morning, the surgeon had already come in to see it, and they had already scheduled the surgery for that afternoon. It was going to have to come off. And she hated that. Her leg swelling, it was apparently ballooned huge. It immediately started going down. Then nurses were coming in, and phlebotomists were coming in, taking her blood. And then a few hours later, like an hour later, they'd take her blood again. And then take her blood again. And she thought, what is going on? And she asked one of them, why are you all taking my blood all the time? And she said she thought it must be really bad, given the look on one nurse's face. They wouldn't answer her why. But she interpreted the look on one nurse's face that this must be bad. This must be really bad. My cancer is spread even further. Karen noticed that she was breathing better. She noticed that she was doing better. Within just a couple of hours, they took her out of ICU and put her up on a regular ward. It was January 5th, this day. That night, her personal physician, I guess you call them GPs here, or you call them PPPs or whatever, her physician, her regular doctor, came to her at her bedside and sat down and said, "It appears you no longer have cancer." And they did not do surgery on the leg because the leg went down so fast. And the surgeon had come to see her that afternoon in a regular hospital bed and said, no, we don't need to do surgery. Not after this. This very day in 2006. They kept her overnight. They sent her back home the very next day. There was no reason to keep her in the hospital. She was doing fine. Now, back in those days, I did not have a phone here at the cabin. So, of course, she wasn't able to call and say, anything to me. I found out only when I got home and was calling up to give my condolences to Wayne about the death of his wife, which I knew would have happened, and just hoping against hope that maybe God would let Karen in heaven with him, and maybe God would let Roy exist again and escort her to heaven. That had been my prayer. Look how God answered instead. It still brings me to tears to this day. Roy's alive. Very much so. And if you have lost a loved one, I know for a fact your loved one is alive too. God is more merciful than we know. And from that day on, I stopped calling everything that happened a coincidence and instead called it what it was, Roy trying to get through to me. And even though I know for a fact now that Roy exists, he still does things at times to get to communicate with me, to let me know that he heard. And with God's permission, does things. Bye-bye from Clarkcroft, New Mexico.